Good afternoon, and welcome to the latest in our EnoMax webinar series entitled Maximum Impact, a unique learning opportunity exclusively for the EnoMax participants and alumni. My name is Tina King, and I am a Senior Manager of Training and Professional Development at Eno. And today's webinar, Predicting the Unpredictable, What Mass Transit After COVID Looks Like, will focus on how transit leaders can manage change during this uncertain time and prepare for what's coming next. So throughout the webinar, please feel free to enter any questions in your question box on the side of your webinar screen, and we will get through as many of those questions at the end of our presentation. Now, I would like to introduce the moderator for today's session, Paul Lewis. Paul is the VP of Policy and Finance at Eno. And with that, take it away, Paul.
Thank you so much, Tina, and thank you everyone for being on the phone. Really excited about today's conversation. It's one that I think we've heard from a lot of folks at transit agencies is, this kind of anxiety about what the future looks like. And there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and there's a lot of unknowns, and I don't think anyone knows what the future looks like. But what we're going to do today is we've invited some of the nation's leading experts on transportation planning and forecasting, and kind of the folks that have been studying this for their entire careers. And what we're going to do is we're going to hear from them. Each are going to give a brief presentation about some of their current research into transportation trends and getting a sense of where things are now and where things are headed in the future. And then we're going to ask a series of polling questions to help kick off the Q&A. So we'll have a few polls that pop up that are kind of pulling at some of the main themes that our presenters will be discussing. And then we'll have a good chunk of time at the end for Q&A. So the three experts we invited are first, and she will present first, Dr. Carrie Watkins, who is an associate professor in civil and environmental engineering at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. Her teaching and research interests center on multimodal transportation, the use of technology in transportation, especially as it's related to transportation planning and operations. After Carrie, we'll hear from Ahmed Janidi. He is a full professor at the School of Urban Planning at McGill University in Canada. He conducts research in the area of land use and transportation planning, public transportation operations and planning, travel behavior analysis, and has a special interest in measuring and understanding the transportation needs of disadvantaged populations. And then finally, we'll hear from Dr. Hani Mahmasani. He is a professor of civil and environmental engineering and industrial engineering and management science engineering at Northwestern University. We'll be talking about multimodal transportation systems, planning and operations, dynamic network modeling, automated vehicles, transit network planning, and his other interests in broader transportation infrastructure systems and smart cities. So a tremendous amount of brain power and interests in this field on the phone. So what we're going to do, like I said, I'm going to hand it over to Carrie to kick it off. She's going to go through her presentation. We'll have Carrie and then Ahmed and Hani all present right in a row, and then we'll start our discussion after that. So buckle up for the next 30 minutes or so, and I'll see you back after the presentations. Carrie, we'll turn it over to you.
Super. Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Tina. Thank you both for having us. It's exciting to be able to present with Ahmed and Hani. All three of us, as was said, have been doing a lot of work in this area for a number of years. I'm going to start off by talking about what was happening before COVID hit when it comes to transit ridership. My group has been doing a lot of research in partnership with several other universities looking at these transit ridership trends over time. And we've been doing this for a number of different sources I'll talk about in a minute. But I think this is part of the reason that we are here, period, is that even before COVID, there were some concerning issues. And so I'm going to start us off by talking about those. This first graphic shows transit ridership by mode, so all modes, and then separately bus and rail. And you can see that the year that we've been working under for our studies is what's been happening since 2012. So, you know, just under a decade of change. And we've seen that bus ridership had already declined in that time period between 12 and 18%. And as you can see on the graphic, even more since the peak in 2006. But what's really been concerning to people in the industry, even before COVID, was that rail ridership was starting to decline since its 2014 peak in addition. And that's something that historically we have not seen for a long, long time. If you want to go to the next slide. What's really concerning, though, is that the US is not alone in the ridership losses that we're seeing, but most of the other countries that are seeing similar ridership losses, and this is data from UITP, so an international organization looking at these kinds of things, most of the other countries have poor economic conditions or some sort of really substantial changes in demographics. Most of the places that have conditions similar to the US, we're actually seeing increases in ridership prior to COVID. So go to the next slide, please. So my group, because of this, we've been doing a number of different studies, some of them funded by different university transportation centers. This is how the US DOT funds us academics so that we can do this kind of research. So I've been doing a few studies for them, a few studies in partnership with my local transit agency, MARTA. I'm here in Atlanta at Georgia Tech, and so I work frequently with MARTA. And they are an Eno-Max member, so hopefully there's some MARTA folks on the line. And then we've also been doing some work for an arm of TRB called the Transit Cooperative Research Program. And that's what much of the research I'm going to talk about right now is from. So if you could go to the next slide. What we've been doing for them in an initial study, we simply looked at how ridership was changing, so unlinked passenger trips versus amount of service provided. So simple things like transit trips versus population, transit trips versus service provided. And I'm just going to show you a couple of the most interesting graphics that came out of those initial studies for TCRP. The first is that as we look at mid-sized or dense cities that are transit oriented, so they have densities that are more conducive to allowing transit to work well, we see that you get more bang for your buck for the transit service that's provided. So you get more ridership for every service hour, service mile that's provided in these more transit-oriented cities than the auto-oriented cities. And that's simply what this graphic is showing. Next slide, please. The next thing that we looked at through this early TCRP study that we did was how things are changing. So we were trying to get an idea of what might be producing this change in ridership from 2012 to 2016. And one of the most interesting things we found out of this is if you look at where these slopes are intercepting, if agencies added no service over that time period, then they were expected to see a decline on the order of 8 to 10% of their ridership. So if you did nothing, you were going to see declines in ridership. It was only if you actually added service that you could stay even in this time period, going back to 2012. Next slide, please. So in the continuation of this, the TCRP study that we're in the middle of right now, we have some early results that they've agreed that it's okay that we start sharing. And as part of this, we've looked at some different size agencies, so some with really high operating expenses, some with mid operating expenses, some with low operating expenses. These tend to correlate with the sizes of the populations. So, you know, if they have more operating expense, there's more service being provided, it's being provided to a larger population, et cetera. So you can almost think of this as big cities, mid-sized cities, and small cities. And we were trying to see how much of the change in ridership we had seen from 2012 to 2018 could be attributed to different factors. This first slide is related to bus. And so you can see we're seeing changes in ridership on the order of somewhere between 12 to 18%. And much of that can actually be explained. The vehicle revenue hours were going up. Land use changes were actually a positive thing, but most of the other factors were negative, and new competing modes is the thing that was hitting across all of these different groupings equally in difficult ways. And I'll go into more details in a minute. If you could go to the next slide. We also are looking at this separately for rail ridership, and there's been less of a change in rail ridership. So these mid-sized cities we're actually seeing pretty even, and the larger cities we're seeing more declines in rail ridership, but it was more minor. But you can see, again, there's more service being provided, so we should see ridership going up, but because of changes in gas prices and fares and income and household characteristics, and especially these new competing modes, you can see that across these different categories, we're having declines in transit ridership attributed to those that in some cases, especially the is causing an overall decrease in ridership. If you could go to the next slide. So to pull this into kind of a little bit more for the text instead of numbers-based folks on the call, we separated into two groups: the causes of net transit ridership gains from 2012 to 2018 and the causes of net ridership declines from 2012 to 2018. And there were two things that were causing those gains. And so you saw that on the previous slides, but I'm going to break them down just a little bit. The first is, again, more service. On average, agencies have been increasing service, which should be resulting in more transit ridership. And then across our models, it showed that it actually would result if it wasn't for these other factors. Service increases were bigger on rail than on bus. And so we were seeing that this would have increased ridership 6 to 7% on bus, 12 to 22% on rail. At the same time, metro areas were growing in population and employment, which would contribute to net increases in transit ridership. However, at the same time, they're becoming less centralized, which partially offsets that. And so we were seeing only what would be about a 2 to 3% bus or rail ridership. But at the same time, go to the next slide, we were seeing 4 different factors, 2 here and 2 on the next slide, that are causing decreases in ridership. And so they are offsetting those positive factors. The first was income and household characteristics. So median incomes are going up, car ownership is going up, more people are working at home. All of those things are contributing to declining transit ridership. And several of these things should be a big uh-oh in your mind, as you're going to hear our next 2 speakers talk about. These are the kinds of things that are going to be hitting us harder post-COVID, right? And we'll come back to talking about that more and more. The other thing is that transit travel is becoming more expensive. So fares are going up after we adjust for inflation, and that's causing a little bit of decrease in ridership. Next slide, please. And then our 2 other things are driving is becoming less expensive. Gas prices, after adjusting for inflation, are at very low rates, and this contributes to declines in ridership because of this lower cost of driving. But the big hitter, what we were seeing as we looked at this later data, and this kind of refutes some of the studies that were done using earlier data sets, but as we have more and more of an increase in TNC usage, and we can look at dates as far out as 2018, what we were seeing in this study that was done across the US on a city-by-city basis is that new modes were definitely competing with transit. Bus ridership more so, and we looked at bike share, we looked at e-scooters, but it's really about the TNCs. So Uber and Lyft were resulting in a 9 to 13% less bus ridership and 4 to 14% less rail ridership. Next slide, please. So Last thing I just wanted to bring up, I was trying to give a picture of kind of some of the things we were seeing before COVID, and you can start to formulate your own ideas about how those same trends may continue now that we're seeing all these changes to how we go about our work and such during COVID. But we've also been looking at the impacts through the COVID period on MARTA ridership. And these graphics are a nice way to show kind of what I think is how we have to start thinking about transit. What we were seeing is that the short-term impacts to rail ridership were significant, but the bus was frequently carrying those critical workers. And so the declines in ridership on our local transit agency, which I think does not differ greatly from several of the others, those declines were not as significant for bus, to the point where bus is almost up to 80–90% of the ridership that it was once carrying. The long-term effects of this are yet unknown. That's what we're going to spend the rest of this call talking about. But really, in my mind, we have to be moving away from defining this problem of ridership and thinking in new ways about how we provide and think about the metrics that really measure the success of transit. And so with that, I'm going to hand things off to Ahmed.
Thanks, Gary. So I'll take it from here. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and it's an honor to be with Carrie and Hani on this panel, and to tell you a little bit about some of the research I've been doing with my team here in Canada. And the main goal of my talk today, next slide, please. Next slide. Yes, is to how did change in public transport service cuts addition due to COVID-19 pandemic impact low-income and vulnerable groups in North American cities. When COVID did hit us, many of the transit agencies, they started changing their schedules, doing cuts, and adding services in some areas. Next slide, please. So the main goal, we said, okay, let's see what's happening. So we went and collected data from the biggest 40 cities in terms of population in North America. And we also looked at those who had GTFS data available online for them for weekdays services between February, and we tried to compare data between February 2020 and May 2020, and we compared how many trips are going through every census block group in the US cities and every dissemination area for the Canadian cities. So to how many unique trips are going through every census block group. Next slide, please. So so what we did is that we looked at the percentage change between February and May and April, depending on what is GTFS data is available and how some of the transit agencies posted their new GTFS data. And what we did also, we normalized the income. So we got the income normalized at the Z-score level to make sure that we can compare between cities, and the change, we made it as percentage change to see how the change in the service occurred. So next slide, please. So the first slide here, we see that all 40 cities, you see the Canadian cities in the bottom and the US cities in the top. And when you see a line going downwards, means that this is an agency that took into account equity and did cut more in the high income areas and then cut less in the low income areas. So for example, next slide, please. If you look at San Francisco and Portland, you will see downward. These are the ones who applied equity aspects when doing service changes and service cuts. We see many of the areas. Some areas like New York, they had like a little bit higher service. Next slide, please. If you look at the Seattle and Chicago, they didn't do much cuts. We don't see in the cloud there in the change of service, not much change, very little adjustments. And in other areas, in the next slide, you're going to see how some areas went into and did cut more from the low income areas, having an upward trend. If we take and look at the next slide, we'll see how when we zoom in to all these 6 areas, and we can see the story behind these 6 areas in the next slide. And when we zoom in, you see that we have the first 2 where equity was being incorporated, low income groups seeing the least cuts, and in Portland and San Francisco, Seattle and Chicago didn't do much changes, and in Austin and Dallas we see the opposite. So I'll dig deep in these 6 examples to show you how this have changed over the period of the pandemic a little bit deeper. Next slide, please. So digging in these 6 areas, and also looking at the financial situation, because there was major financial challenges happening. So we applied the same methodology, but this time we subtracted the data from 2019, from February to September, 2020, from February to September to 2019, and we did it also at the census block group level. If we go to the next slide, we will see the big deficit that many of the transit agencies are projecting. Chicago projecting in 2020 $668 million of loss in projected revenue losses, as an example, while San Francisco is projecting 500 million in losses. So it's a major financial problem, and we see how much the CARES Act funding is giving for each region, as you see there. If we go to the next slide, we will start digging deep in month by month and city by city, but I'll zoom in because we cannot see in details here. So I'll zoom in the next slide, and we'll start seeing how it changed. So if you look at Austin, for example, we see that in Austin, it gives us a little bit of a story that in February and March, we were seeing a little bit of change, which is almost nothing happening. But when the pandemic really hit in April, we see more cuts in the low income areas, where you see the line going a little bit in the left, and it goes upward to the right. And it keeps going like that from April, May, June, July, August. We start to see the line a little bit adjusting. And then in September, we see something very interesting with Austin, that they are actually adding service. So they're restoring service. They're adding more service in the low income areas compared to what they had prior to the pandemic. So we see that some areas had a little bit around 50% increase of number of buses going through a census block in terms of services. If we go to the next slide, we'll see the details for San Francisco, how nothing was happening in February and March before the pandemic. In April, San Francisco was not doing really well. They switched the services, they cut things, and then Jeff Tamlin came and he said, okay, we are redoing everything and we are starting in a different way. And since May, they have been really one of the most progressive agencies in their service cuts and in restoring the service. Now they're restoring services a little bit in September, giving more to the high income, but still the low income are their priority. Looking at that service in the next slide, you're looking at that in terms of service frequency and how the service cuts has been changing by income group. And we see that we divided the people in the region to 5 income groups. We see in the San Francisco case how the line goes down, and then we are catching up and increasing the service. So we went from almost 350, 360 trips going through some of the census blocks to down to 150 in some cases. But at the same time, you see Chicago and Seattle, how they are flat, and Portland is coming back and moving up. The most interesting one is Austin, because Austin, we see the service came back and even came back at a higher level for the low income groups, the very lowest income group. If we go to the next slide, what we try to do, we said, okay, we are working into North American context, and we know that there are other aspects in terms of equity we need to look at. So we looked at, made a combined vulnerability index, a Z-score for percentage of non-white, percentage of those without a bachelor degree, and we inversed the income. So then if you have a low income, you are adjusting the Z-score, so then we can add all three and then divide it by 3. If we look at the next slide, we see how in terms of vulnerability, each city has did the service cuts. And what we see in San Francisco, still we are in a good shape. We are cutting more in areas that are less vulnerable, and the high vulnerable areas are getting the least kind of thing. Remember that this curve now is reversed because we reversed the income. So this is reverse of the other figure. If we go to the next slide, we'll see that the service cuts in the frequency, we still see the income is reflective. And San Francisco, the most vulnerable group, we see the same thing happening there in terms of in the recovery in September, where we see that they're giving more service to vulnerable groups even when opening, and even before cutting, the vulnerable groups were getting the most number of trips in a day. Austin, we see that we don't see the curve pushing up, so it means that here they might have been the addition of the service that went in after COVID did go to low income neighborhood, but it's not especially non-white neighborhoods did not get the bigger share in there. Chicago and Seattle, we see it almost flat, but still giving a very high level of service. And the most interesting part is the level of service that we see in San Francisco and how frequent the buses are compared to all the other region when we look at it from a vulnerability standpoint. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we can say that the early responses from various regions did harm low income and vulnerable groups. San Francisco and Portland were one of the most sensitive agencies when it came in May, when we started noticing, okay, there's a pandemic going on and we need to take an action and rewrite our schedules. And when they rewrote their schedules, we saw that in terms of income, they were doing the best compared to other region. And in the next slide, we also saw that in Seattle and Chicago did not cut service. It's a choice that the transit agency made to cut or not to cut service. So Seattle and Chicago ended up not cutting. They have big deficits, but also it has to do with the kind of population they're serving and how much they want to make transit as a viable option during the pandemic. Austin's reopening in September is one of the most interesting cases, how they were bringing back service and more service to the low income groups and vulnerable groups, how they did that. So at the end, I'd like to, in the next slide, I'd like to acknowledge the team who worked with me, and that this is not just my work. I have an army of 5 students who have been helping me in pulling that together, and also the funding that received from the NSERC and the National Science and Engineering Research Council of Canada, who has been funding us through my discovery grant with them to do this research. And now I'll hand it to Hani to give you a bigger perspective from around the world of what's going on. Thank you so much. So can, next slide.
All right, okay. Got it, great. All right, hello everyone. If I could have the slides, please.
Go on to the next slide.
Can I share them myself or? Okay,
no,
great.
we've got them here. Just tell us when we move on to the next slide, honey, and we'll move them that way.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. So thank you to the Eno Foundation for getting this panel together. This is an extremely important topic. It goes to the core of urban mobility and to the whole recovery process post-COVID or as COVID is unfolding. So what I'm going to share with you are some of the just really descriptive characteristics of how the recovery process has been going on around the world, taking into consideration both the sort of historical structural decline that Kerry alluded to, and then some of the changes that the agencies themselves may have made while the disease was progressing, and the various policies associated with that progression were being implemented or loosened up, as the case might be. Okay, and so the question we're asking is: are cities recovering? And again, what is the data telling us about the usage of public transport and urban mobility? Next, please. Okay, so just by way of background, our center has been, again, tracking this process really since the onset of the initial lockdown, in terms of first how supply chains were impacted, and then looking at the reopening process, the recovery process. And in July and August, we conducted a series of virtual roundtables, which are available online. You can see the URL there. It's tiny.cc/TCAVR. Those were leaders in the public transportation arena, including, for example, President Dorval Carter, who is president of the Chicago Transit Authority, as well. And we had both domestic and international representation, and then various other elements associated with mobility as our cities are reopening. So for those who are interested in this, I think it would give you even more context about, for example, why did Chicago have that flat line that Ahmed just showed us? Because there was a strong belief that transit is part of the sort of core mobility infrastructure in a city like Chicago. It is, many people do depend on it, and for those who depend on it, typically essential workers, reducing service was out of the question, essentially. And in fact, what happened in Chicago, the service was added in certain areas in order to promote social distancing, because, again, depending on sort of neighborhood, etc., there are some areas where ridership was quite high, and in those areas, to promote social distancing, in fact, service was added. So it kind of gives us important context to, I think, this whole process. Next, please. Now, if you look at overall mobility in the US, if you use, there's several providers of cell phone tracking data. This particular one is from Cubic, and they have a mobility index. You look at the variation year to year, and you could see clearly the drop that we had in April, significant drop associated with lockdown, etc. And then starting in May, June, etc., that level has pretty much regained its pre-COVID levels, meaning in terms of people's overall mobility, trips are happening, essentially. People are doing things. They may not be going to work every day. They may not be using transit, but overall mobility by one mode or another has to a large extent recovered. And this has been the case now for, since at least since August. Next, please. So Google Community has this community mobility report based on, again, tracking individuals who opt in, and you could see that the change in activities in various different areas. And clearly, you look at travel to transit stations down 38% relative to baseline, travel to workplaces down about 33%, and that's essentially your remote workers or work from home compared to baseline. Of course, residential, that is trips that involve the residents and not a workplace, have increased because of the work at home phenomenon. And what's interesting, if you look at parks, now you see plus 3%, and this is in October. These are the latest values. If you look at a month earlier, next please. This is in September. The parks value was up 92%. Transit and the others are fairly similar, but there was so much more recreational travel, primarily auto-oriented, of course, and that was the case in most communities around the world. If you look at the sort of increase relative to baseline of travel related to parks, recreation, etc., they were almost doubled. Okay, next, please. And so this is kind of giving us the overall mobility picture. Now, focusing on reopening our cities and public transportation, of course, the question is, will people ride again? Of course, if you recall, many agencies, this one here happens to be from Transport for London, basically they said, go home, don't travel, save lives. So in a sense, the transit agents, the sort of industry during the worst of the pandemic, sent the message, do not use transit. Okay. And then later, of course, use it if you must. And then now, of course, it's sort of safe to travel and so on. But so the UITP, the International Association of Transit Providers around the world, has been compiling since the onset of COVID statistics on ridership from around the world, and I'm going to share some of those with you to see how different places may have been reacting to the various policies that have been in place. It's a fascinating data set. Next, please. Yes, again, compiled by UITP, they get full credit. Andrew Bata in particular, thank you very much for this terrific service that you've been doing for our community. Next, please. Okay, so here I have cities that had pretty much recovered. These were kind of the best cases that I was finding essentially in terms of recovery. So I took Vienna, Austria, where you had a recovery to about 80% level, and that seems to have plateaued right at about that level. Again, in all of these cases, it's relative to a relevant corresponding date of 2019. There is some variation across the different agencies. Now, if you look at Oslo, a month ago had recovered to about, again, 80%. More recently, it has dropped considerably because there is a bus driver strike, and that's a separate exogenous factor. Now, what's also interesting here is on all of these graphs, UITP is plotting the number of cases per 100,000 residents. And so you could see in Vienna, for example, as the cases have been increasing lately, the ridership has not correspondingly dropped, other by than a very small amount. Of course, again, Oslo now, because of the driver strike, has become another issue. If you look at Berlin and Germany, again, cases are increasing, but transit recovery has kind of hovered at about 70–80% level. And what's interesting in Berlin, which is different from many other cities, is that bus, tram, and metro have recovered to about the same level. You look at Milan, there was a drop when the vacation period ended, and interestingly, and currently there's been more sort of restrictions and so on, but still there is you have a recovery to about 60% that is retained. Next, please. So those were examples of cities that had recovered to about 70–80% level. You look at the next set that we have here. You look at Transport for London and then some of the North American cities. Transport for London had recovered to about 55% or to about 60% on buses, but you look at the tube and that's only recovered to about 30–40%. Again, there are restrictions on group size, for example, that will affect how many people you can have in a given in a given vehicle. You look at Montreal, Canada, and they're very similar to North American cities. Quicker recovery on buses than on metro, recovery to about 40–50% in this case. You look at New York, more sharply there you could see the difference between buses and subway, recovery to about, again, 60% on buses, a little under 40% on subway. And then Chicago breaks it out by different type of services. And you could see the CTA, which is the, sort of the main sort of urban system, buses have recovered to about 40%. But what's interesting is that suburban bus has recovered again to about the same level. But then you look at metro, only at about 25%. That's CTA trains. And then you look at the commuter rail, and that's Metra, and there the recovery has only been to about 15-20%, even less, largely because of work at home, essentially higher income commuters that are not traveling anymore. And so when Ahmed showed earlier that service has remained flat, he was only looking at CTA, the urban sort of core service. Metra, on the other hand, has cut its service dramatically. Commuter rail service has been cut significantly and only now is being sort of reinstituted. Okay. One thing that's interesting, if you look at New York, where I've circled things, they at some point stopped the. Initially, they were saying no front door boarding and no fare collection. They reinstituted that, and once that was reinstituted, you could see a drop. So there is still a fare sensitivity here that is at play in this situation. Next, please. And these are some other interesting cases. This is in Moscow, where both buses and metro appear to have recovered to about 60+%. I've included Shenzhen, China, because presumably, the disease has been, mitigated completely. There we have a recovery to about 80%. But what's really interesting is that taxi is ahead of buses, and and cities that have reported that, we've seen that as well. So there's been faster recovery than bus, but TNC has been slower than both, not necessarily the case in the US. And one that's particularly interesting because of the way the policies have been, have been strict and then relaxed and then reimposed again. This is Auckland, New Zealand. And during the lockdown, level 4, down to 0, essentially, no service, nobody was traveling. And then it sort of came back to about 70%. Then level 3 was reimposed, dropped down to below 10%. And now that recovery is only about half of what it was previously. So in the second cycle, recovery is only by half of what it was previously. And again, before that, it recovered to about 80% or so. So there's some very interesting cycles here in the dynamic. And the question is, how do we ever go back to 100%? What happens next? Next slide, please. UITP also has compiled different recovery rates from around the world for both buses and trams and also for rail. You could see that the recovery rate here has been generally, well, again, a lot of variation across cities, as we have illustrated. Next, please. But generally for metros, the rate of recovery has been much lower than it has been, than for buses. Too much information here to go through, but I just wanted to let you know that this has been compiled by UITP. Next, please. So some observations that even under the best of circumstances, the recovery in ridership so far has not exceeded 80% anywhere in the world, with most cities in the range of 50 to 60% when the epidemiological cases appear to be under control. There is considerable variation across cities around the world, with recovery levels not exceeding 40% in many cities, for example, in the US. And that typically corresponds to the travel needs of essential workers. And really, this crisis has brought out the core importance of public transit for essential workers in most cities around the world. We could not have the healthcare system functioning. We could not have all the basic services in most cities if transit had just simply gone away or shut down, certainly in a place like Chicago and New York. Okay. Now, bus service appears to be recovering faster than metro systems, which in turn have recovered more than regional commuter rail services, which are right about 15–20%. Taxi service appears to be recovering faster than public transit, but that kind of goes back, well, I guess taxi/TNC, I guess that goes back to some of the trends that Carrie had brought out earlier in terms of TNC competition, and that's not going away. But gains can be lost quickly when there are reversals in health recovery, number of cases, though the verdict is still out on the European experience now across different countries as we have a resurgence of cases, but yet no perceptible drop in public transit utilization, largely because the severe lockdown policies have not been put in place. Most of the policies today affect indoor dining, bars, opening hours at night, but not so much basic sort of services and work, which is where most of your public transport use tends to be. But in general, public transport may be one of the last mobility services to recover, opening the door for perhaps more fundamental policy rethinking here that addresses some of the issues that Carrie has mentioned. Next, please. And so this is, in fact, an opportunity to maybe perhaps rethink mobility as UITP has put it forward to us, back to better mobility. It's our chance to build back better, bringing cities back to people. Next and final slide. So there are policy implications which we can draw perhaps from these numbers and these trends that, you know, as Carrie mentioned, transit in its conventional form had been in structural decline. Again, it's a business model with heavy dependence on public subsidy. That model has been strained in several cities, and there's been a struggle to sort of maintain that level of service year in and year out, as the need for this service has been increasing in various cities, certainly cities, in terms of providing alternatives to congested roads. Ride-hailing services had been slowly taking market share from transit, and COVID-19 related changes added significant financial burden. Who pays? Ahmed had a very nice slide kind of showing here the budget shortfall associated with it. Some cities have received a significant infusion from the PPP, the CARES Act in the US, and other places have also stepped up to keep these services, essential services, floating. But as we look beyond this, in fact, and we think about other trends that had been ongoing, say with autonomous vehicle fleets. Okay, you combine autonomous vehicle fleets with TNCs, that would really be another threat to the role of transit in the medium to the long run. And to the extent that transit needed rethinking before COVID-19, now is in fact the time to be engaging in these kinds of discussions. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and we'll be ready to take any questions.
All right, thank you, Hani, and thank you to the other presenters as well. We got about 45 minutes or so for the balance of this webinar, and so we want to go into a discussion. I know I've seen a couple questions that have come into the question chat function, and I see those. I want to get to those for sure, but I want to start kind of kicking off the conversation here with a little bit of interactivity, and we've prepared a couple poll questions for folks on the line to respond to some of the things that we've heard. And one of the first issues that's come up, and there's been a few questions about this too, is about timing, right? I mean, I think the title of this conversation is Predicting the Unpredictable. We're obviously discussing and speculating about a very unknown future. And the big elephant in the room, of course, is COVID, and no one knows how long the pandemic is going to last. But having some sense of timing, I think, would be helpful in agencies recognizing on how to respond. So I'm going to pose a somewhat unscientific question to participants. If we could throw that question up, and you should all see it pop up on your screen. And the question is, how long will it be until most Americans feel comfortable riding public transit regularly for commuting, errands, those kind of things? So please go ahead and throw some responses, or throw your answer up there, and we'll come back in a few minutes, I think. A lot of people voting here. I will leave it open for just a couple more seconds here as people are contemplating, and then we'll display the results, and then we'll talk about what these mean. Okay, I think we can show the results. I think most people have voted. Okay, so you should see the results of the poll. Looks like about half of you think that we'll be back to somewhat normal in terms of transit in about a year. Some are pretty optimistic and saying this is going to be 6 months. A few of you are a little more pessimistic, saying that it's going to be 2 years. That's 41% of the people on the line. And nobody, I'm actually really surprised that nobody thinks that this is a forever situation. I'm actually fairly heartened by that response, but let's hear from Carrie and Ahmed and Hani. You know, what do you think about these responses? Where would you have voted, and you know, how do you think things are heading?
I'll jump in. I'm also heartened by the fact that no one said never. I love the response that one of my favorite instructors once gave to these kinds of questions. It depends, right? And so level of comfort is not something that it's like, you know, the decision is will they take transit or not, but you need people to be comfortable first. But even if they're comfortable, we may not see a rebound in the same way. And I think that's a lot of what we're going to talk about over the rest of the time here. But I think that, you know, just baseline, it's really going to depend on a lot of things, a vaccine and how effective that vaccine is and how necessary their trip is. And I think that there's going to be less things pushing people towards transit that might have in the past, because congestion may not return to the same level that it once was if telecommuting is going to stay the same way. And so to a certain extent, I'm not sure that it matters if they're entirely comfortable. There are some people who are going to have to be back on transit, and there are some people who, even if they have a small level of comfort, they're maybe not going to push in that direction because they're not forced to.
Very good. Ahmed, Hani, anything else to add to that one?
We like in Montreal, the expectations is around 2 years. The models that they have been developing, they have been saying it's around 2 years, maybe like late 2022 when we'll get to back to the levels, and we are expecting around 5 to 6% of people will stay in the telecommuting kind of thing. We're not expecting the telecommuting to be a major change, and that was like part of the new strategic plan that came out today. There was a press conference, and they were asking these questions, and the predictions that the modelers have been coming up with for the Ministry of Transport in Quebec, saying with a vaccine at these different times and different scenarios, they're expecting something around 2020, end of 2022.
Yeah, I think it's not so much, you know, I think in terms of just the comfort level, if you want to use a shared mode, yeah, that will depend to some extent on how the, you know, the pandemic is evolving and so on. I think the issue is more when the sort of travel patterns are going to be, as Carrie mentioned, will again favor that. So you know, there were people who didn't feel comfortable riding transit, you know, even before COVID, and it's not clear that those are going to be any more comfortable, you know, riding transit. But in terms of those who were willing users, essentially choice users, let's say, a lot of those are in a situation where the travel patterns may be different. So they may be comfortable riding it, but this is not currently corresponding to their travel patterns. And so there's several variables that will you know, be taking place there. Again, I think short of having a major sort of super spreader event that is associated with transit, I think the trust is rebuilding. I mean, we've seen it in Europe, for example, people that, you know, where people really have no other options if they have to go to work, for instance, you know, and so people were right. I think the agencies have conveyed a sufficient sense of we're clean, it's safe to be on transit, we're distancing, wear your mask, etc. So with these sort of caveats, a lot of the resistance, I think, is coming down. But I think the overall sort of recovery, I think that, in terms of the trip patterns that call for transit use, I think that's probably the bigger question.
Got it. So I want to point to go to another poll question here in just a minute, but I think that we talked obviously about COVID, that's the thing in front of us, but you all mentioned some long-term structural problems facing transit that are not only affecting transit ridership now, but probably will in the future. And so the poll question that come up now is, what do the folks on the phone think is the biggest threat in the long term, from 5 or more years, to robust transit ridership? So and again, we have 5 factors here. There are myriad more that we could include, and we'll talk about some of those. So there should be, it's like there was there's supposed to be a 4th question up here about increased auto ownership, but let's just use these as the answers in front of us and make sure that we can include that in the discussion. All right. We see the responses coming in. About half of you have voted. We'll just give it a few more seconds and then we'll turn off the poll. Again, these are certainly unscientific questions and intended to promote some conversation and some reactions. All right, we're at about almost 2/3 of you have voted. So let's go ahead and close the poll for now and get back to the discussion. Now let's see those results. All right, so it looks like the most prevalent threat, at least from folks on the phone, think that emerging technologies and automated vehicles are the biggest threat. But still a sizable chunk thinks that alternative modes, low gas prices, and even COVID-19 fears pose the greatest long-term threat. Now, of course, we had originally intended to put increased auto ownership on here, which I know some studies have shown have been a big source of ridership decline. And I also think telecommuting, something that came up in the last discussion, could be something we could add to here in a future poll. But let's turn it back to the experts here. What do you think are some of the greatest threats to robust ridership in the future? Go back. Let's start with Hani, and then we'll go to Ahmed and then Carrie.
Yeah, so I think we've already kind of discussed some of the threats in the context of the sort of structural trends that we had seen. I'm going to jump directly to the solution here in a sense, because in many ways, transit needs to think of itself as a mobility as a service provider. Ultimately, it needs to become a mobility provider, not just a fixed route, fixed schedule service. And that would then means that rather than competing with these threats, you somehow co-opt or you cooperate with these trends, and then you focus your resources where transit is best. And typically this has been moving large numbers of people in selected corridors and moving them fast in a way that no other mode can do that. A lot of the sort of collection, neighborhood pickup, etc., either go to bicycles or rely on some of these new technologies in cooperation, possibly competition with TNCs. But I mean, the main threat is the business model ultimately, which requires increasing amounts of subsidy year in and year out that is not offset by revenue sources that are predictable. So if the fund, unless the funding situation is adjusted in a way to continue increasing to provide this level level of mobility, which in fact is not beating alternative modes. The way to deal with this ultimately is to, again, become a mobility as a service provider for cities.
I totally agree with Hani on that. I was like when people said you had like some 15% or something said COVID-19 fears 5 years from today. That's really pessimistic. I hope we won't be in that situation of COVID as a long term. So it's more. I hope it. I think and I hope and I believe in the science that it's going to be a short term thing, not a long term. The changing of the business model and the changing of the financing and this changing how we think about public transport is the solution, and that's how I see it. I see like the changing of the model. You need to change the way we're thinking about public transport, that it's an essential service to get a lot of people efficiently from point A to point B, and as efficient as fast as possible, that nothing else can beat that. So if you're going to put the entire city in automated vehicles, we'll be still stuck in traffic. We won't be getting out of traffic. So transit is here to stay, and we have to work how to make sure it is financially viable in the future.
So I would say, to build on both of those, I really see the problem as the combination of these factors, as opposed to, we force the audience to pick which of them. And I'm thinking some of the people who said COVID-19 fears, maybe they're thinking more along the lines of longer term impacts of COVID-19 as opposed to fears specifically. But I think of sort of, that we have less congestion, that that telecommute. I'm not sure, Ahmed, that in the answer to your last one, that it's going to be as minor. And I think Hani is really the expert in this, how much telecommute is going to continue, and how big of a factor it's going to be going forward. I think we've all learned how good we actually are at giving webinars and doing meetings via Zoom and BlueJeans. As much as we've had trouble, I think for the large part, a lot of people have done well with it. And I think that's going to have longer term impacts. I'm curious to hear what Hani would say to that at some point. But so in my mind, it's the combination of these things. It's the fact that if we don't have congestion, if there's not a lot of people driving because they're telecommuting, which is a holdover from COVID, then we will continue to have low gas prices. We will continue to have more people buying vehicles because there's not a lot of incentives to get them away from vehicles. And if anything, automated vehicles, if they're introduced at the wrong time, they may actually make it so that congestion gets worse in good ways, and it actually boosts transit up more so. So I think the timing of how all of these things are intertwined is where we have to get out front with policy, thanks to folks like Eno, to make sure that we're not creating worse problems than we had even before COVID.
Some really good points. I want to shift the conversation. I think you guys are picking up on some really interesting things. But something that came up both particularly in Hani and Ahmed's presentation, and Carrie touched on this too, is the international component. How is the U.S. comparing to examples abroad? Certainly there's some good cases in the U.S. and Ahmed had some good data on that. And there are some interesting recoveries both here and in international cities that we looked at on Hani's slides. So I'm curious to see, I've got another poll here. How well do the folks on the phone, how well do you think international transit agencies are responding to COVID-19 to ensure the safety of staff and riders? Is it better than American agencies, worse than American agencies, or about the same? Understand that there's a lot of complexities in this question, but we're just kind of generally getting a sense of where folks think the international agencies, how international agencies are holding up to U.S. counterparts. So go ahead and vote. We will We'll tally these up here in just a minute. Okay, we've got a good amount of folks have voted. We can go ahead and show those results. So almost none of you, it looks like maybe one or two people thought that international agencies are doing worse. Most people think that they're doing better than American agencies, or about the same. So I guess two questions. You know, what from the folks, and maybe we'll start with Ahmad and do Hani and then Carrie. You know, would you agree with this assessment? And then what are some of the specific things that agencies internationally are doing that we could learn from?
If you consider Canada international, I consider it
Yes,
international.
absolutely.
Actually, the US is doing better than the Canadian when it came to the service cuts that we studied, because of the federal laws there that makes them, any changes in transit service, you need to make sure that you're not harming the low income groups. So that was a very good protective to the low income groups. And if you go back to the figures I showed, that you'll find that most of the Canadian cities were cutting more from the low income and leaving the high income service as is. On the other hand, you see very good examples from San Francisco. They did a total overhaul and going really very well with the low income, giving the marginalized groups, the non-whites, more service. You see Austin, how they moved very nicely, giving more to the low income. You see Chicago and Seattle, they said, no, it's an essential service. We're not going to cut anything in these areas. So if you're comparing to Canada, I would say, no, US was doing better in most cases. Hani can speak about the other European, because he was involved with the UITP, and Gary might have some ideas as well.
Yeah, I'd like to actually echo what Ahmed has mentioned, and I want to encourage you really to go and watch the roundtables we had done, because we did one with domestic agencies. We had Chicago, Jacksonville, and Washington, D.C. Then we did another one with London and Vancouver. So we kind of covered a lot of territory there, and the representative from UITP. And what's really clear, well, first of all, there is variation, of course, across any, both the US and countries, around the world. But if you look at what US agencies have done, generally, there was a lot of comparability really between what was being done internationally and what was being done in the US in terms of cleaning protocols, all the different kind of things to protect staff. I mean, all of them were very concerned about protecting staff, perhaps, to the same extent, if not more than others. So I would say in terms of practices, they were, very comparable. I would say that Transport for London did probably more research, to study kind of, if somebody's coughing and talking and trying to determine distances empirically. They kind of brought some of their universities and research centers to study these things for them. But as the Transport for London gentleman had said to me then, he said, in London, you have no choice. It's not like you could drive, if people want to go any place, they need to use transit. They rely on the transit system much more so than they do in the U.S. So in some ways, U.S. agencies had to compete even harder for their riderships to convince people, because alternatives are more readily available than they are, for example, in European cities. So no, by and large, let's say about the same, if not, or if not better in some instances.
Yeah, I think I would echo what both of these guys are saying, that I think the way that the US agencies have been responding is phenomenal. They really have put priority on taking care of their workers to the best of their ability, while still providing essential services to get people where they had to go. It's not an easy problem to solve. And I think that there's been fantastic things happening throughout the US, equal to what's going on in other places. I would say the big differences are the riders, and sort of how we in the US are making decisions over mask usage. And even the one that I never hear here, that having done some study abroad trips and research and such in Asian countries, particularly in Japan, is the whole concept that silence is golden. So, you know, not just wearing your mask, but excuse my language, but shut up. Like, don't talk when you're in a shared space. Like, I'm sorry if it's impolite, but don't say hi to people. Don't, like, we've got to get rid of that right now in the American mindset that, you know, silence is golden. Throw on your mask and don't say anything. And the amount of you know, potential virus that you're shedding is significantly reduced. And if you happen to be asymptomatic, you're not going to pass it on. I feel like those kinds of situations, like there's a much better understanding of this, not just in Asia, but in Europe as well. And that's part of the problem that we've had. And I think some of the transit agencies here have done a good job of trying to enforce some of these things. It's just, we have to get a grip on the American public.
If I may just interject one thing, yes, you mentioned Asia, and I think there's an interesting model there because that, you know, you have societies that have been much more intrusive in terms of using technology. Like, you know, and unless your cell phone says green, you can't get you know, onto a train, and that's the South Korean model, for example, and various other sort of societies there where there's been to some extent more of an intrusion, I guess, on your, you know, personal privacy, etc., than is generally tolerated in the U.S. and in Europe, for that matter. So, you know, no, we don't. You know, we don't. I mean, our university now has an app to enter buildings, but the transit agencies here could not impose, let's say, this type of situation. Partly because, again, a lot of the lower income, I think, groups that Ahmed was concerned, you know, in terms of service to them, may not necessarily have own the technology to be able to deploy instantly, and that would then shut them off from mobility and from jobs, etc. So there's, you know, it gets complicated in that regard.
Yeah, that's a good, and you know, that same point has kind of come through in a couple of the questions we've received, and you know, I think that agencies also in the U.S. Try to determine their success or failure based on policies and procedures they can't necessarily control, whether it's auto ownership or pricing of the roads or things that certainly affect ridership, but that's not necessarily in their purview. When you guys touched on the fact that mask mandates are not part of the purview of transit agencies, I mean, do we think that the generally better recovery in terms of ridership we've seen on international examples is in part due to the fact that they have stronger centralized governments that they can put mask mandates on nationwide rather than kind of the hodgepodge regionalism that we have here? Carrie's shaking her head, yes. Yeah, okay.
You know, again, there's, I think, a lot of variation inside Europe. In the Netherlands, they don't want to wear masks, you know, and there's very strong, you know, their prime minister says these things are useless. And so, you know, there's a lot of variation, I think.
And their case numbers have shown that they're wrong, honey.
Exactly. No, I agree. Yeah, I mean, so it's you know, there's diversity, I think, even within the European model in that regard. Yeah. So,
got it.
But, you know, there's been interesting things that I want to mention, small things, but, you know, they tend to be in the background. I mean, I've been very interested for years in how you use technology, real-time data to run your operation. I know in Chicago, they were using real-time data to determine how crowded some of the buses and trains were, and then to add service in certain areas where there is, you know, where they see more ridership. And they were doing this essentially in quasi real time, for instance. And these are, you know, small, you know, things, but they actually do make a difference. And the crisis has motivated, I think, the agencies, the progressive agencies, to actually do more of these kinds of improvements than otherwise.
Yeah, in Vancouver, they're keeping a certain percentage of buses on the side, and then in real time they deploy them in certain locations, and they started that in September, around 10%.
Yes, yeah,
So they were saying that.
yeah.
Well, Hani, on the last point on your slide, you said that a transit overhaul is absolutely necessary. And I think that it was not just in how we provide service, but in what is transit, right? I think that's kind of what you were getting at. And I think it's important to talk about what a transit overhaul would entail and what does it mean. And when thinking of this question, we need to think about the purpose of transit in the future. And if we look at traditionally what it's, pre-COVID, certainly, transit has kind of served two roles at the same time. One, it's providing an essential public service, providing mobility to folks that don't have a car or other means. And it's also serving as a resource efficient means to move large volumes of people, usually to downtown areas, but also to sporting events and those kind of things. And agencies have done their best to kind of strike a balance between the two. And so in our last polling question, I'm curious to see what people on the phone think of the primary purpose of transit in a post-COVID-19 world. So once there's a vaccine and we've recovered, is transit going to be mostly mobility for those without other means? Is it going to be a resource efficient means to move large volumes of people? Or do we think that it's going to equally be about both in terms of its core function? So go ahead and vote on this one. This is the last poll question, and then we're going to turn to other questions from folks. There's a few teed up here after we discuss this one. Now go ahead and submit your votes. Just wait another couple seconds. Last call for votes. All right, let's see the responses. Okay, so a pretty sizable majority of you folks on the phone think that transit will continue to serve both functions, but about a little more than a quarter think that it's mostly going to be mobility for those without other means. And it looks like a few folks still think that it's going to be a resource efficient means to move large volumes of people. Interesting responses. When we were putting these questions together, this was one that I think Carrie really encouraged us to frame. So Carrie, do you want to kind of talk through your thoughts on this and your reactions to those responses?
So I asked for this question because I feel like my thoughts, at least in this area, were different pre and I would say short-term post-COVID. Longer-term post-COVID, I hope the answer is both. But I think in the immediate and even for a little while post-COVID, I think it's really about making sure that critical workers, people who have to get somewhere on transit, are able to do so as safely as they possibly can. And keep in mind, having them do so efficiently is how you keep them safe, right? Having somebody who has to be on transit for 2 hours to take a trip that should only take 20 minutes is not the best way to keep that person safe when there is some risk of spread while they're on transit. And I think sometimes we are so fixated on chasing choice riders that we forget about the people that Ahmed's research was talking about, those people who really need transit to be there. And so, in my opinion, I think longer term it needs to be both, but in the shorter term, I'm excited that there seems to be this shift to making sure that we are serving people who need transit really, really well right now.
Ahmed, any thoughts on that one?
I agree with Carrie. One of the things that I think we have to start changing the paradigm, changing the idea that we need to make sure that we have X number of ridership every day in the thing. This is not our measure of success. We have been always saying the transit is going down, so we are not doing so that's not that's measure of we're not succeeding in the system. No, we are succeeding because we want to make sure all essential workers and everybody who doesn't have a choice can reach that destinations that he's going to, because he is a service to everybody else. So we have to start changing the idea of it is an essential service, put it at the forefront, make sure we cover that first, and then after we cover that, we can start and adding the layers of let's get more of choice riders on board as much as we can. So the choice riders comes after we fulfill the needs of those who are essential, and we need to have to balance new metrics. And to do that and not relying on ridership, then it goes back to the overhaul that Hani is talking about of, okay, we need another financial model now, because we see that clearly we cannot depend on the ridership for the revenue, and we cannot get the system to die. Even when we cut the service, nobody succeeded to cut the service to zero in any region. No, everybody said for all of us to live our lives, we need the transit to function and to be there, because we can get all our needs as a society all over the world. So we have to shift the financial model and the performance measures we're relying on in terms of ridership now. No, we have to incorporate other aspects like equity, like essential services. That has to be the forefront, and we get the politicians to think about it that way and to think about it from a funding perspective. It's not a gift that the federal government gave us money and saved us today. No, we need a stream of funding that's stable, and everybody agrees on that to make sure it stays and functions.
Hani,
Yeah.
this was your question.
Well, I view transit as vital urban infrastructure, infrastructure in a broad sense, including services. You cannot really reopen cities and revitalize cities essentially without public transit. And if we step back, I guess we go to not that long ago, before COVID. Our biggest problem was congestion in many cities, right? We were dealing with congestion. We also, another problem is we wanted cities to become more walkable. We wanted them to be more friendly to active modes, and wanted to see more activity, in neighborhoods, etc. And we had we wanted the different kind of mobility that is perhaps more equitable, and more widely available. I think none of these things are going to go away when we think even medium term. If anything, the current trend towards I'm going to stay in my car, I'm going to go to a public rally and sit in my car, in a big parking lot. If anything, that's probably more the aberration than sort of the normal situation that one would expect. Cities have not reopened yet. There may be people eating outdoors, a few tables here and there, but you don't have concerts, you don't have, you don't have ball games, you don't have big festivals. And, you take a city like Chicago, where when the weather is good, essentially there are big gatherings that are taking place all over. And all of these kind of gatherings rely on transit. You could not do the big festivals in Millennium Park, etc., without having transit essentially feeding people into, into those areas. And so we have to think in terms of a more normal life ultimately, where transit is going to be critical. So going forward, again, I want to go back to the notion of transit as a vital mobility provider, and the old model of we're only going to serve this route or that route, we're going to cover every possible area of town, no matter the density and so on, needs to be reconsidered. I said overhaul. That's a strong term. Overhaul implies both the nature of the service and the kind of arrangement for funding it, sustaining it, and so on. But I would say rethinking at a minimum would be helpful. And then based on that rethinking, determine the extent of overhaul that might be required to accomplish that. I'm personally very positive about about both the essential role of transit, certainly in terms of meeting needs of those who don't have alternative. But I really want to see it also as a competitive mode that people rely on, a reliable competitive mode that is providing a level of service that people actually enjoy ultimately. It's all going to go back to the user experience, which is what we were focused on, pre-COVID. It is even more so the user experience with fear. But if you strip away the fear, that quality of the experience will remain essential for transit to really be to play the role that we expect of it.
Got it. So there's a couple questions. I weaved a few of them into the conversation, but there's a couple actually on transit-oriented development that I want to make sure that I get to really quickly. So first one, I think, Carrie, this is just a clarification question for you. How did you define transit-oriented versus auto-oriented? Is that based on data to define those two classes?
Yeah, it is. So I'm not going to remember the exact number off the top of my head. And if the person wants to reach out to me via email, I'm happy to point to the report and such so that they can find it. But we were using long-held values that are included in the Transit Capacity and Quality of Service Manual for what a certain population density has to be, and we came up with comparable employment densities. So these are sort of long-held values of what transit accessible is, and then we looked actually within the different cities and tried to define areas that were transit accessible within and what percentage of their area had these kind of transit serving densities versus the entire service area. So that's kind of how we came up with it. If you go on TCRP's website, all the reports are available for free. So you should be able to find the report. And if not, you can send me an email and I'm happy to give more details.
Got it. And then a quick follow-up on that is, what we've seen in a lot of American cities is that those dense areas that are very transit accessible are also gentrifying or have gentrified. And you have higher income folks moving into those areas that are not as prone to use transit, particularly now. How does gentrification play into the long-term declines in bus and rail ridership in big cities?
So I can jump in on this one also, but these two fine gentlemen probably have some great answers as well. We attempted to do some research to actually look at this. Part of it is to look at gentrification, though, to actually see those changes in population, to be looking over a pretty long time period. And so we were trying to relate transit ridership declines to gentrification, and we found that hard to do in a lot of cities because the gentrification has been happening over a somewhat shorter time frame. And it's hard because of the data that you get from census and such. We aren't really measuring, we don't get those kinds of variables on a really refined measure to look at this within a city. And so it's a particularly difficult thing to look at. I would say anecdotally, absolutely yes, of course. I mean, I think it's a pretty obvious hypothesis. And then, I think we're not going to have a lot of surprising studies when we actually can get the data right to be able to look at this. But absolutely, there are people who have been moving more into these cores of the city who use transit in different ways. And are very quick to flip over and use Uber and Lyft instead of transit when transit is not suiting their needs very well, because they have the financial means to make those decisions. And I think that pre-COVID, we were seeing the effects of that very much so. Now what I'm reading is saying that post-COVID, like, people are pushing away from density, right? And so those same sorts of people are like, well, maybe I don't want to live in a city anymore. And how long that lasts, I think largely depends on how long we're sort of in COVID. These are not short-term decisions. So as much as you're like, oh, I hate being in a dense situation right now for this year, there's a lot of great things about cities that even during COVID, I got to tell you, I live in a pretty dense environment, even though I'm in Atlanta, which is a fairly lower density city. But I love the fact that I have 4 hospitals that I can go to if I need you right now. So there are some great things about density as well, and that's never going to go away. So I think there's always going to be this fight over who wants to live in cities and how do we balance that people who choose to do so are taking advantage of the good parts of density when it comes to using transit.
That's great. And I want to make sure we have this, I know we're almost out of time. And I promised the presenters that they would each have a chance to talk about some of their ongoing research initiatives and things that they're doing right now. Carrie, I know you have a slide or two to go through. Let's start with yours, and then we'll go to Ahmed and then Hani.
I can make this very quick. I'm sorry I dominated the Q&A. We have a new center that is funded by the US DOT, housed at Georgia Tech, but in partnership with the University of Kentucky, with University of Tennessee, and with BYU. Hani has another one of the new centers that just came out looking at telecommuting. That's what I was alluding to before. Ours is particularly looking at transit ridership change and how we react to that. So we are going to go through developing a set of strategic visions that we can model, and we're going to try to turn those tools over to agencies and regional planning agencies for them to be able to use them in their own scenario planning. What I would just say is if there are any agencies or not transit agencies, any folks on the call who would very much like to have input into this center, please send me an email at Georgia Tech. I might have failed to put my email. Could you go to the next slide? There were two of them. Hopefully I was smart enough to put my email address. Yes, there we go. So we have this whole research plan in here that I won't go into, but please get in touch with me if you would be interested. We're looking for sort of experts to interview and transit agencies to interview to talk about a lot of the things we've been talking about on this call about, you know, how do we move forward past not just COVID, but all these things I was talking about that came before.
Okay, let me segue into our DOT center, which is where we've been spending quite a bit of our activity. As Carrie mentioned, we were awarded a Tier 1 DOT center along with UC Berkeley and UT Austin, dealing with telemobility generally. So that includes telecommuting. It also has a strong focus on e-commerce and changes that have happened in that realm. By and large, the theme is impact of ICT and e-commerce on travel demand, but we have refocused it on sort of COVID impacts specifically and how much of these impacts are going to stick at the end of the day in terms of the telecommuting that we're seeing, but also in terms of e-commerce, because we think, for instance, e-commerce is going to stick a lot more than telecommuting, in terms of behavioral patterns. So we've been, kind of contemplating at this point of various surveys of consumers and so on, but we're also working closely with industry on that project, both kind of omni-channel retailers as well as the sort of last mile delivery industry on the e-commerce side of things. So that's one of the areas. We're also working with our regional rail entity, Metra, on sort of modeling some future development scenarios. Again, the scope has sort of evolved when COVID hit, and we're kind of doing some regional impact modeling related to various possible scenarios having to do with land use and service changes and so on. So I'll just mention those for now, and then thank you for the opportunity to mention those.
Thank you. Ahmed?
So we are working on different projects now in our team here at Montreal. The two significant ones are we're working with medical doctors on measuring the impact of COVID-19 on to interview dialysis patients, those who were going for treatment in the hospital 3 times a week, to understand what was happening there and how much dangerous they were thinking in their brains, and what are the thoughts about the services. In many cases, they use paratransit. Sometimes, some are not all of them are allowed to regular transit. Some of them go on regular transit. Some are not allowed to paratransit. So we're interviewing these right now, launching the survey. Hopefully, we'll get the ethics soon, and we'll launch the survey. So that's a major project that we're working on with the head of the nephrology department here at McGill. And we're also doing a major study on measuring the impact of a new light rail in Montreal. It's a $6 billion project that's being built now. So we succeeded to secure a $1.3 million funding from the federal government to do a study on the impacts of that. And it's very interesting how we'll be collecting the next wave during COVID now to understand how people are actually perceiving the future of public transport as well.
That's great. Well, I really appreciate everyone sharing it. The purpose there was just to make sure that folks on the phone know that there's a lot more coming in terms of research. You should absolutely feel free to reach out to any of our presenters today with follow-up questions or things, not only now, but in the future. And really want to thank our presenters. And I'm going to actually hand it back over to Tina, who is going to close us up. And again, really thank everyone for joining. Tina.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to my wonderful panelists. And Paul, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And for everyone joining us via webinar, please stay tuned for more webinars in 2021. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.